The following program is an interview with Kathleen Cleaver, wife of Eldridge Cleaver. Mrs. Cleaver arrived in the Bay Area Thursday. It was her first time here since 1969. She's come to gather legal support, political support, and financial support for Eldridge Cleaver so that he might return to the United States without having to be arrested upon his return for violation of parole in 1968. She's interviewed by Yolanda de Freitas of KPFA, Jean Wiley of Third World Media News, and Cheryl Johnson of the Third World Women's Alliance. And she begins the interview with an explanation of the situation in Algeria, which is the reason for her visit to this country. Later in the interview, Mrs. Cleaver speaks of the women question.
So the situation is sort of one of expectation. Everyone anticipates something will happen because during the period of time from the 1st of August, on which the Delta Airlines flight was brought to Algiers, and the 18th of August, which was the OSPAL Day of Solidarity with the Afro-American people, at which we had scheduled an open house, which was not allowed to be held by the Algerian authorities. It was quite a bit of tension, conversation, repression, house arrest, interrogation, intimidation against the members of the international section, the hijackers who recently arrived, and other people affiliated or associated with the Afro-American community that's Black Panther Party international section represents. So it's been a very, very tense situation and very unprecedented. It was all more or less brought to a head by the open letter that Eldridge wrote to President Boumediene. And this open letter was written because of the difficulty of explaining our position in any more, I would say, more face-to-face form. And it was used to express our analysis and our feelings about the hijackings and the situation going on inside the United States and the nature of our struggle and the reasons we felt that the money should not be returned to the United States authorities and that, in fact, it should be given to us. That was addressed to the President on the 2nd of August. Now, on the 8th of August, the hijackers themselves, they had been released to us, were also addressed an open letter articulating very briefly basically the same position, and that letter ended up with a request that the money either be returned to them and they be allowed to stay in Algeria, and if not, then money be returned to them and they be allowed to leave. And the following day, the international section headquarters was occupied. All the members were put under arrest, and this was, they called it protective security. This was totally unprecedented in Algeria. And people were quite shocked. So 2 days afterwards, it was released, and then we announced that we would hold the open house, and it was scheduled for Friday. And Friday, after a series of conversations and negotiations, it was not allowed to be held. People were turned away at the door. And so the situation was extremely tense, and it was clearly two totally opposing positions about the same phenomenon. And the problem was a matter of, it stated a matter of bridging the area in which liberation movement was allowed to operate within the territory of Algeria.
How has the Algerian people related to your presence there?
They identify with it. You see, before our office was, before our movement was given any type of accreditation or headquarters in Algeria, we had, how to say, we were participants in the first Pan-African Cultural Festival in 1969 in July, which was held in Algeria. Black Panther Party participated in that. It was the only group from Afro-American struggle that was there, and it was the first time that this had happened. And the people there, they identified very readily, and they really dug it because of a revolutionary tradition and spirit that they have there.
Does Eldridge and yourself feel that you have continued the struggle even though you've been in Algeria, and how do you feel that you've done that?
Well, what you have to recognize is that it was during the time when Malcolm X was alive, he articulated and even initiated the process of internationalizing the struggle of the Afro-American people, of taking it out of an issue that is only confined to the geographical boundaries of the United States and putting it on an international level as one of the many struggles going on in the world against the international phenomenon of colonialism, of imperialism, and racism. In terms of what our struggle is up against, it's international. The very same forces that we have to fight here have to be fought in Africa, have to be fought in Asia, have to be fought in Latin America. So I think this is what the activities of the international section, once it became consolidated, because these activities on the international level began in early 1969 as soon as Eldridge left the country. But they were never, we were never endorsed and given office and recognition and full freedom to operate as a liberation movement until 1970. In fact, on the 13th of September 1970, when our office was officially opened in Algeria. And I think that on the international level we did something that had never been done before. And in fact, the opening of that office in Algiers represented a very historical event, in the sense this is the first time in the history of our struggle where any other government has even recognized that we were engaged in a liberation struggle against these same forces of colonialism, imperialism, and racism as the other liberation movements were, and that any government outside of this country had recognized this as a legitimate struggle. And this is very important. If you remember, during the career of Malcolm X, he did travel through Africa. He did travel in North Africa, and he did speak at the OAU meeting, but it was much more of like investigative, informative thing, and he did expound a position, but it was never concretized. And in the work of the international section, you see this whole analysis concretized and put into motion. This was in the period from 1969 to up till now. But what's happened is that, whereas in 1969 and 1970, it was a very positive and very powerful thing that we're able to set in motion on the international level, and through many different types of activities. One of the most outstanding was the visit of the American People's Anti-Imperialist Delegation to North Korea, China, and North Vietnam in the summer of 1970. Another activity was the visit of a delegation of the international section of the Black Panther Party from Algiers with members from other areas to the People's Republic of the Congo, which is very, very important to us and our struggle, we felt. And the ability to organize among the black GIs who are active and struggling in West Germany. We have a tremendously in West Germany. And all of these things were possible during that period of time. However, now the political climate on the international level has altered so tremendously that it's not possible to function on that level. In fact, many of the politics that were represented by governments that we were able to visit and to have negotiations with during that period of time have changed. The personnel have changed through either attempted coups or right-wing splits or whatever, the same phenomenon that you see going on everywhere. The visit of Nixon to the People's Republic of China was a tremendous setback to the entire international struggle of revolutionary struggle, liberation struggles, whatever, because here people saw that the highest level of power and revolutionary fervor in the Third World, had extended its hospitality to the, number one enemy of all the struggling peoples in the world. And really now, when you look at the situation of the Vietnamese, they're being increasingly isolated and increasingly stabbed in the back by their allies in the socialist camp, and also the Palestinians being isolated and stabbed in the back by their former allies. And all over the world, wherever you find revolutionary forces, you find a conflict, a confrontation, a suppression of them by their own government, or their own people, like the split that went down in the Congolese Workers' Party and the People's Republic of Congo, and the power struggle that took place in the People's Republic of China, which Lien Pao has been named the black sheep of. But I think everyone can see now that there's a profound difference in the politics articulated in the past by Lien Pao and those politics being implemented in the present by Chu and Lai. And these are the types of problems in this type of atmosphere that our international work has been carried out. And as that alters more and more in favor of imperialist powers represented by the United States or by social imperialism, then it becomes increasingly difficult, and we also become more and more isolated and unable to have any type of productive results in that situation.
I did want to ask you what your relationship to the Black Panther Party is going to be now, and if Eldridge comes back, because, are you considered the international faction of the Black Panther Party?
Well, we don't like to even talk in terms of factions, because what you have is, at one time in history, there was a group of people organized under the name of the Black Panther Party who moved along a particular ideology and a particular structure. Now, as that structure and that ideology became more and more developed, the contradictions between people who related to one part or people who related to other also became more developed, until those contradictions between different ideas of how to struggle and how to structure an organization and where the primary effort should be, where the primary resources should be, and what really your political objectives were, became impossible to be carried out in the same organization. And there were a series of contradictions and splits and expulsions and such things from starting really in 1969. And the last most public one was the one between members of the Central Committee themselves. Those Central Committee members who were living in Algeria in exile, and those Central Committee members who were in this country. And much of the problems had to do really with the structure of the Central Committee itself, which all the efforts to develop more in harmony with the structure of the party had been blocked, and there were quite a few problems there. And I'm sure everyone is conscious of the fact that we had a strong role in one phase of the development of the Black Panther Party, and view that as our contribution, as our way of participating in the Afro-American liberation struggle. The way the Black Panther Party is operating now, many people other than us feel is not really very effective in contributing to the advancement of the struggle, and are seeking another form of organization, another avenue, but that would carry out that same objective goal and have the similar type of ideology that's even more developed in relationship to our environment. And these are the efforts that people who have been referred to as a faction, and many people outside of that, have been engaged in, trying to come up with the proper structure and the proper ideological perspective to advance the struggle on to a higher level, instead of just stop at one particular phase and just stay there.
If plans should go as you assume, and this is also like asking what you mean by a higher level, what way would you consider your organization continuing the struggle here, and what direction
Well, for
would you
example, you could talk about the efforts to expose and to eliminate police occupation of the black community. You can talk about the efforts to expose and eliminate the oppression of the court system, the oppression of the prison system, all the avenues of control that the system places upon black people, and how do you go about first exposing them, first educating the people to how they operate, and then organizing an effective tool for smashing that control, you see. And then when you turn around and see people deciding to cooperate with that same system, to join, in fact, forces with those instruments, then you see that they were interested mostly in exposing and explaining, but not in organizing a tool to smash that apparatus, but in organizing a pressure force against that apparatus to the point where that apparatus allows them to join it. And that is not really anything that could be considered revolutionary. Really, it's something that's called reform. And in any struggle for liberation of an oppressed people, you will always find those elements that will participate up to a certain point, but will stop at a certain level of reform. And this is a very profound tendency in our struggle of groups and organizations that come up with a very militant or a very powerful position against changing a certain aspect of the system, and then they will settle for that aspect of the system not being eliminated but being reformed.
One thing I wanted to ask is, like, there are contradictions and you resolve them, you know, internally and externally. And like, because I know this question of reform comes up many times with organizations, but in order to break anything, you know, and really wage a righteous struggle, you have to work internally with that. And, you know, sometimes that's revolutionary. And like, I want to know, you know, what do you feel about that? For instance, let's say like a trade union kind of thing. You may have to work inside that trade union to organize it in order for the people to, you know, to raise their consciousness. And that, you know, is working within something, but it's raising the level of the people.
Also,
at the same
sometimes
time.
you might have to organize another kind of union within that same industry that's based on different principles to show people that it's not the principle of having a union that's at fault, but it's the ideas and the way in which this union is functioning that's at fault. And so either you try to operate and change the union from within that union, or you try and form another union that by contrast shows people within the union and without the union that there is an alternative means of obtaining the same objectives as a union.
Yeah, but that is still working within, you see. You know, in other words, I guess what I'm getting at is like sometimes you have to, you know, work with the masses at a certain level and build towards that other process.
Well, I think that was what the objective of the Black Panther Party was, you see. And then when you stop at a certain process and say, well, now we're not going to do any of those things that we did in the past, but we're going to do this. For example, when you have in 1967 a position of organizing, arming, and educating the community to fight against the forces that are plotting genocide against us in 1966. This is a primary principle of the Black Panther Party. And then in 1972, when these forces are so much more powerfully organized, when genocide is much more clearly a reality, when people are much more willing and much more conscious of the need to fight against them, then you turn around and say, well, no, we're not going to do that anymore. I think that raises some other kind of questions than what you're talking about.
At Thursday morning's press conference, you indicated that the situation is a precarious one, but that it is not a question, and that Eldridge Cleaver's life is in jeopardy, but it's not a question of the Algerians refusing asylum. Is it then a question of a refusal of protection? Or,
well, it would be hard to say that, but I think it could be clear that once people express a profound difference of opinion politically with an organization, that their relationship to that organization is affected by their difference of opinion. And I think that the tactics that have been deployed against us in Algeria are less than those that could be considered receptive or supportive. The tactics of police action in place of political negotiations to resolve what was a very highly political problem. And you see, you never find these tactics used in anything but a political situation. These are very definitely political tactics out of a whole realm of political tactics that could be used to resolve a problem.
What is the nature of, let's call it the conflict?
Well, in Algeria, the conflict, the one that came to the surface, centered around the viability of using ransom as a tactic of raising funds for revolutionary activities.
How does that also relate to the hijackings, in the sense that there were all these people trying to escape from the United States and all coming to Algiers? Like, how did that affect you? In what particular?
Well, it put much more spotlight and pressure on us than had been before.
Were all these people Black Panther members?
No.
Seems that the question of women might be insignificant in relation to the struggle as you've been talking about it right now, but I would like your opinion on that subject.
Well, I don't think there's anything about women that's insignificant, well, I'm a woman, and I'm involved in all of those problems that I mentioned, and I think that all women who are oppressed, part of the oppressed community, are involved in those situations, especially when you talk about something like the adult authority. Although it rules the lives of men and women who are in prison, but their entire families, either their husbands or their wives, their children, their mothers, and everything are totally disrupted by this arbitrary power. And it's an issue that not only concerns several million prisoners, but it also concerns several million women in the state of California.
What do you think of the women's liberation struggle?
First thing about the women's liberation struggle, that's when I was in California, right before I left, the women's liberation struggle was just sort of like getting on its feet. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of like a group of women who were sitting around. They were disgusted with the political organizations and the way they treated women, and because of their political orientation, they wanted to do something about it. But it was really not a movement. It was like a discussion group type thing, and it was predominantly white. And there was also, parallel to that, within the political organizations in which third world women were involved, a similar struggle, but it was inside the organization. Like the women were struggling for their own rights and their own positions inside this organization, whereas the women's liberation movement was forming groups just of women outside of these political organizations, and they were putting pressure on the organizations that were mixed. And so they raised the issue of women's liberation, of male chauvinism, and they forced it into the political arena where everyone had to confront it and had to deal with that. And that was a very positive accomplishment. I think we have to look into, to a certain extent, the history of the movement for the emancipation of women in this country, which has always been dominated by white women, and at every strong period in the movement for the emancipation of women is paralleled by a strong period in the movement for the liberation of blacks. And so I think that we see some kind of social parallel there in the struggle against racism and the struggle against sexism, whereas the blacks will be struggling against racism, mostly men and women together, as a result of this struggle on the part of an oppressed community. Within the white community, among the white people, the more oppressed women also began to wage a struggle for their emancipation. And in terms of the worldwide struggle for the emancipation of women, the vanguard of that struggle has always been inside the United States. As a result, you might say, in terms of the white women coming out of probably the whole frontier bag, where the distinctions between women and men were not so great as they were on the very much more structured class system that existed in Europe. And in terms of the black women, the distinction between the woman and the man slave was not so great as it was in the more structured society that the blacks lived in Africa. And so you have a breaking down of distinctions a much less sexist society developing in America, both in the slave population and the settler population. And so the traditions inside the United States as far as position of women are far more liberal and advanced than in most countries of the world that have a much more static or feudalistic base to their culture. However, it's in those areas where the women that have waged a national liberation struggle, such as in North Korea and China, North Vietnam, and have engaged effectively in the socialist construction of society after a prolonged war, that we see the position of women having changed the greatest from what it was prior to the struggle to what it is today. Whereas maybe the women in the United States have a much more advanced, we didn't have to go through a thing where we were not allowed to walk on the same side of the street as men, as in Korea, or where women were not even allowed to look at their husbands in public as in Vietnam. We didn't start from that base. But in terms of how far the struggle of women in the United States is going, I think we have quite a long way to go. And I think that that the domination of the women's liberation movement by whites has had a very negative effect on the even ability to raise the issue of liberation of women in black and third world communities, because it comes with a negative connotation, but that's not true, you see. So it's used against us, although the problems as far as women's problems are faced are far more profound in the oppressed communities than in the white communities, as you know so well by your triple jeopardy title of the magazine.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen, you have the triple role of wife, mother, and political activist, revolutionary. I have two questions. One is, first of all, how do you personally cope with those roles? I mean, what advice would you give for a woman who is a mother and who is a wife and who wants to move very, very solidly into political activity?
Well, first of all, they can't have very sensitive feelings.
That's for sure. Seems like.
And secondly, they have to be very convinced that what they want to do and that it's right, and be able to organize their life and make up their own minds and push for what they want, because they will confront a very powerful resistance. I don't care what the nature of the organization or the work is that you want to do. If you are a mother and a wife, you have very powerful resistance in that your place is in the home. And with the upsurge of nationalism in the black community, I'll just say nationalism and national consciousness. I'm not talking about the desire for revolutionary change of the society. There's also this upsurge about, well, now, the place of the black woman is in the home. And in the face of the type of oppression and exploitation and murder that our people are being subjected to, both men and women, I think this is really like a petty bourgeois dream. It has nothing to do with our situation, and that it could only be imposed after centuries of struggle to get us into the position now where we're in a much better position to fight than we were during the conditions of segregation or during the conditions of slavery, where the women fought as hard as the man and no one ever came around talking about the woman's place was in the home. And now that so much struggle has been accomplished, people are coming around, or men are going around saying, and some women are going around saying that their position is in the home. And, I say maybe it is in the home, but I think your home should be well armed, because too many people are coming in the homes of black people and killing them at night, you see. So we don't have that type of luxury to relate to that at this time.
There's a lot of sisters who really have a lot of conflicts, trying to work out of, like, working in an organization, being a mother, and also the other reality that there's a man that she lives with. And really trying to strike a balance with all that. And,
well, we can't strike any kind of balance as long as we relate to it as individuals. The only type of balance can be struck when we can move to some type of collective level, where a certain number of sisters and brothers who are all struggling for the same struggle will parcel out certain areas of work. That certain of them will be able to do political work, and certain of them will have to do housework, and certain of them will have to do children work, to give some type of participation, not on the basis of, well, you have to participate because you're a woman, or I have to participate because you're a man, but in terms of what kind of work has to be done, you see. Now, it's true that in the majority of cases at this time, military and clandestine and more aggressive actions is the province of men, and more or less supportive and politically, you might say, secretarial, and these type of more peaceful or more, how would I say, second-line type activities are the province of women, but that's not any necessity, you see. And a large part of that is because so many women do have small children and they have to stay and live in a certain way. They're not, but that's not true, and we should be the last people to try and put any more obstacles to our struggle for freedom by talking about who can't go where and who can't do what because of this on a superficial level. I mean, we have enough very overwhelming real obstacles to overcome, and I think we have to be leery of these people who are talking about all these sexist obstacles that they have to be put in the path of our struggle for freedom. Myself, I'm very opposed to all of them, and I've been fighting it for quite some time.
What did you think of the Shirley Chisholm campaign? And
I thought
Shirley
it was
Chisholm
good propaganda.
Why propaganda?
That's all it could be. Propaganda means giving out information, raising ideas, expounding positions, and rallying people around new information.
One question that I have is that because of bourgeois feminism and the way it has, really affected third world women in the struggle, I wanted to know if you saw like a third world women's group being divisive to the struggle. An independent third world women's
No,
group.
from what I've heard of the Third World Women's Alliance, I like it very much because it is very political, whereas too many of the, I might say, mother country women's liberation groups are not particularly political. Their politics are the politics of feminism, but they're not necessarily the politics of anti-imperialism or anti-capitalism or anti-racism. And I think that the Third World women's struggle for emancipation has to be, and it's only realistic if it's linked into our struggle against colonialism and all in our sexism is within that context, you see, and we'll never be able to realistically get trapped into a feminist struggle. It doesn't even make sense. Right. Like in the situation in North Korea, which I'm more familiar with, where the situation of the women was so feudalistic, the more well-off women weren't even allowed out of the compound. If they wanted to see, they had these swings in the compound where they look out, they could swing and look out over the wall to see what people were doing. But in a situation like this, it was the organization of a women's alliance that enabled the women to be able to participate in the struggle, because the divisions between men and women were so profound. There's absolutely no way that at that time for too many women to participate in anything that men could participate in, although that was the main point of the Korean liberation struggle, that the equality between the sexes become a reality. And they did have women guerrillas, and they did have women involved in everything, but the base of that was the creation of a women's organization that participated in the struggle as a women's organization, and from that level of participation and that developing of political consciousness, then women could go into the youth organization or into the People's Army or to many other types of organizations. But it is very necessary in the colonial women's, third world women's situation that there be some organization to pull primarily the women, politically educate them, explain to them, because otherwise they feel intimidated. You see, too many women are too intimidated really to go and join organizations that are political. But if it's a women's organization, they might come and sit and listen and become politicized, and it's also very effective. You see, and it can be much more effective than, because the status of women is still, as far ideologically in the system, is so low that if it's a women's organization, obviously it couldn't be doing anything serious. You see, so then the fact that women are organized gives them a possibility of having some type of effective force in the struggle, and in terms of their own interests. And the organization of women also gives a basis for the collectivization of certain types of activities, because considering the way our community is disorganized, when we talk about collective house keeping and collective living and collective child care, still the bulk of that's going to fall on the women. And in our community, there's so many more women than men. I mean, it's just that way. And women's organizations are very, very important. Women and men, I mean, it's just that way. And women's organizations are very, very important.